originally used by Christians of the early church as a means of identifying fellow believers and marking specific meeting spots that they would use during the times of persecution. It just helped them avoid persecution when possible. Now, we talked about this last week as well, that the word ichthus is literally translated fish. And but the significance in the ichthus is not in the translation, but in the fact that it's an acrostic. And so last week we kind of laid out the acrostic there. Those are the letters of ichthus. And so we talked about last week that the I, or the iota, represents Jesus, or the title Jesus. And during that message, we focused on the humanity of Jesus. And so today we're going to continue in this series, and we're going to look at the next letter, the key, which it represents, and we can switch to the next one, represents Christ. It's literally translated Christ. And so sometimes people have, like at Christmas time, they write Xmas. Like some people are like really offended by that. Because, maybe a secular person is trying to take Christ out of Christmas. But honestly, religious people understand that X is actually representative of the Greek letter chi, which in shorthand is how you write the word Christ. Just like a little bit later on, we're going to be looking at another one of the letters, the theta, which also, when you see a theta, oftentimes it's just an abbreviation of God. Because the Greek word for God is theos, and the theta is the first letter. And so in this acrostic, we looked at the iota, which is Jesus, meaning Jesus. We looked at the humanity of Jesus. Today we're going to look at the key, which is abbreviated for Christ. And we're going to look at the prophecies related to the Messiah. Okay? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. If you look at Matthew chapter 16, we're just briefly going to look at this passage. Matthew chapter 16, probably a very familiar passage to most of you. In verses 13 through 16, Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And then Jesus turns the question to them. And he asked, well, who do you say I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are, and depending on your translations, if everyone has their Bible open, most people do, right? I want you to look at your Bible. How many of you have the word Christ there? A few people. Everyone else has what? Messiah? So it's interesting. And the NIV, I primarily use the NIV or the ESV or the NASB sometimes. But the NIV in the 1984 version of it, translated that you are the Christ, the Son of God. In the newer version of the NIV, they translated Messiah. And, sometimes it just annoys me. It kind of frustrates me. Why did they feel that necessary? And this one is not one of those times, though. Because the Greek word there is, in fact, the word Christos, the word we're looking at today. It is literally, you are the Christ. There's a definite article in front of it. It's not an indefinite one. It's not saying you are a Christ or a Messiah. There's a definite article. You are the Christ. But the word Christ is a title. And so the older NIV, or if you have the word Christ there, basically the translator said, hey, we're going to translate the title. Really, it's a transliteration, if you want to get technical, of the title Christos. We're gonna translate the title here so people understand that, hey, this is the Christ. You are the Christ. In the newer NIV, instead of translating the title, to help people understand what the title represents, they translated the kind of definition. And when you see the word, like Jesus Christ, when you see that phrase together, it's not Jesus' first and last name. Like some people think that, like you can kind of tell, like in the context that they're using it, especially when it's in a derogatory way. It seems to me they think that's his first and last name. When in actuality, it's a statement of Jesus being the Messiah. And Christ, the title Christ means Messiah. And so I want you to understand that. So we're going to use those two terms interchangeably, just like they did in this passage. Literally, the Greek word, you are the Christos, the Christ. Christ literally means Messiah. And so today, as we look at this title, Christ, we're going to look at the prophecies related to the Messiah. All right? The Old Testament has the Hebrew word there that is kind of interchangeable, is Meshiach, all right? And it literally means the anointed one, okay? And that specific phrase is only used 2 times. But when it comes to prophecies about the Messiah, there are over 350 specific prophecies made in reference to the coming Messiah. And I want you to understand that. Some of them, they probably didn't understand it specifically at the time, when others were very specific. When it comes to these prophecies, though, I want you to take a moment just to think about the significance of the prophecies. 350 specific statements about the coming Messiah, some of them as early as 1,000 years before the Messiah came. Okay? Our nation is about 250 years old, give or take a few years. Okay, 4 times the age of our nation, the United States of America, 4 times longer than we have been in existence, prophecies were made about an individual who was coming. Very specific prophecies. Incontroversial prophecies about one who is coming, to become the anointed one, the one set apart to be Messiah, to be Savior of the world. And when it comes to these prophecies, they weren't just like general prophecies. These prophecies focus on all kinds of circumstances surrounding the Messiah's life. They focus on his birth, his childhood, his ministry, his death, burial, resurrection, his purpose, priorities, qualities of himself, attitudes, passions, his relationship with God, his relationship with humanity, and the list goes on and on. Very specific prophecies. Probably one of the most complete and explicit prophecies that we can see in the Old Testament is found in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah was written about 700 years before the coming of the Messiah. And throughout the book of Isaiah, there are scatterings of prophecies about the coming Messiah. There's one section in particular, though, that I want to look at today. If you were in our starting point class last week, I read most of this to you guys last week, but I want to read it to everyone this week. Because in this passage of Scripture, in Isaiah chapter 52, starting with verse 13, Isaiah 52:13, going into Isaiah 53:12, I just want to read this passage to you so you can get an understanding about Isaiah the prophet writing about one who is coming 700 years later, and how specific the prophecies were to who Jesus was and what he experienced and the role he was intended to play for us, a fallen world, a broken people. And so why don't you just, if you have your Bible, grab it, open it up to Isaiah chapter 52. Starting with verse 13. The words will be on the screen if you want to follow it there. But this is what Isaiah writes about the coming Messiah. And once again, I just want you to think about the specifics and how comparing what Isaiah wrote 700 years before to specifically what you know about the coming Messiah, Jesus Christ. All right? Just what you know about his life, and especially the circumstances surrounding his death, because this is what Isaiah is writing about. He writes this, "See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted." Just a reference to the fact that people would come to see him and know what he experienced. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, disfigured beyond that of any human being. and his form marred beyond human likeness. I mean, just a reference to his scourging and the beatings that he took in preparation for his crucifixion. It says, so he will sprinkle many nations, and just a reference to the work of his blood. He will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Like we talked about this last year when we talked about the humanity of Jesus, the fact that he was just like a normal guy. People looked at him in his ministry and they were like, how did he get this knowledge? How did he get this understanding? How did he get this power? Like, how is he able to teach like he does? How is he able to do these miracles? We know this kid. Like we saw him grow up. You know, he was the carpenter's son. We know his brothers. We know his sisters. Like, how does he have this power and authority? Like, what Isaiah is describing is like they saw him as just normal person, like just an average kid working a blue-collar job. He said he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, and like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us have turned to our own way. But the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. And like right there, very specific about Jesus in this false trial he was going through, standing before the high priest as people were making these false statements and false accusation about him. Jesus said nothing. Jesus didn't try to refute what they were saying. He said nothing as he stood in front of the high priest in this false trial. Starting back at verse 7, he was oppressed and afflicted, and he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to a slaughter, as a sheep before a shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring prolong. He will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. He bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. And so as we think about what Isaiah wrote, like in those two chapters, some very specific references to not only Jesus' death, but his punishment, his persecution, and his childhood, and how he responded to these false accusations, the fact that he was victorious, that he died and came back to life. Like all of these things that Isaiah was talking about came true in the life of Jesus. As we think about this term, Christ, we need to understand the significance of the prophecies about the Messiah. We think about when this passage was written 700 years before. And the people of Israel, they respected Isaiah as one of the greatest prophets as well. knowing what he had prophesied, and seeing, exactly what he prophesied playing out in front of them, like how many people missed it. Like how many people, understood the prophecies from a historical perspective. Like, hey, I understand, I remember those things were said, but in the midst of it, they couldn't see the forest for the trees. Like they understood the words, they were familiar with the teaching, but they missed it playing out in front of them. The amazing thing is that as we begin to study the life and ministry of Jesus, we begin to see that not only the prophecies made in the book of Isaiah, and specifically in Isaiah 52 and 53, but all of the prophetic statements that were made about this Messiah, all 350, were lived out in the person of Jesus. But the evidence of the Messiah doesn't stop with the prophecies. I want you to understand that. It's not just about the prophecies. There's also another thing, the foreshadowings of the Messiah. And I want you to understand the significance of the foreshadowing of the Messiah as well. See, the evidence through the prophets or the prophecies were words that were being expressed, like teachings that were being explained to people so that they could identify, like, one is coming, and all of these things are going to take place from the place of his birth and the time of his birth and the circumstances of his birth to, his childhood, to, his life and teaching and his priorities, to, like what we read in Isaiah, the circumstances around his death and his crucifixion and the significance of his life. Like all those things were teachings. But God didn't stop there. He didn't just prepare us for the Christ or the Messiah through words. He also used actions, and that's what the foreshadowings were. Like circumstances that God led to be. Circumstances that took place in history that people could look to and think, you know what? As we look back on that, we see that the circumstances at this time foreshadowed what would take place in the life and in the sacrifice of Jesus. I just want to, there's many in the Old Testament that point to like the sacrifice of Jesus and why it's so important. I just want to look at a couple today, all right? The first one is found in Genesis 22, so way back in the very beginning, okay? Way back in the very beginning, the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 22, God has created this relationship with Abraham. And we know a little bit about Abraham's, his life. Like before God, God kind of appears to him and says, hey, leave your country and your people and go to this land I'm going to show you. And thinking about Abraham and the significance of his faith, there's a reason in Hebrews chapter 11, he's the first person mentioned. Like the significance of his faith, the fact that like before he had a real relationship with God, God appeared to him and said, hey, leave your country and your people and go to the land I'm going to show you, and I'm going to make you into a great nation. And he picks up everything. And at that time in history, family was everything. Family was a security. Family was a means of income. Protection was found in the family. And Abraham was called to leave all of that and trust fully in God. And he didn't even tell him where he was going. He's like, hey, go to where I'm going to show you. And so he packs everything up, and he doesn't have a U-Haul. He's putting it on camels and mules and donkeys and putting it on his possessions on his back and his servant's back. And they're carrying everything they have. And they're just, what the Bible describes is they're just walking. Like they don't even know where they're going. Like they're just walking. And from that type of faith in the beginning, God begins to say, hey, I'm going to make you into a great nation. And after a while, Abraham's like, hey, I understand this is what you said. I trust you. I packed up. I've done everything. I'm moved. I'm going exactly where you want me to go. But God, I have no one to give. All the blessings you're blessing with, I have no one to give them to. I'm going to have to give them to my servants' children because I have no one. And God's like, hey, I'll take care of that. And once again, Abraham gets impatient, and so he has a child through his wife's servant. Ishmael is born. And God's like, hey, I'm going to bless him. But you're going to have a child through your wife, Sarah. And I think at this time, like Sarah's like 90 years old, Abraham's like 99, and he's like, we're kind of past the age of childbearing, and I don't know about them, but I'm 50 now. If Robin told me today, like, hey, surprise, we're having another one, I probably would have a heart attack. And so I can't even imagine Abraham, like what he's thinking, like at 99 years old, and his wife, and like his wife's like in the tent laughing, like, oh, that's a funny one. But a year later, Isaac's born. And so, God has proved his faithfulness for a while now through, like, when he packed up and he's blessed them and protected him, and like, they're wealthy now, and now he finally has a son. And so in Genesis chapter 22, God kind of throws a wrench into Abraham's life. Because he's like, hey, I know I promised you this. I know that I promised you that through Isaac, like the world's going to be blessed. You're going to have, your descendants are going to be more numerous than the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. And I recognize that. But what I want you to do right now, Abraham, is that I want you to go and I want you to sacrifice your son to me. God's like, I want to test your devotion. Do you really love me more than anything? Do you really trust me more than anything? And amazingly, in chapter 22 of Genesis, in verse 2, it says, God says, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountains, and I will tell you about. So Abraham packs up his son, gets a bundle of wood, sticks it on Isaac's back. Abraham's carrying the fire and the knife, and they make their way to the top of the mountain. Abraham begins to build an altar, and he puts the wood on the altar, and Isaac's like looking around like, okay, we've got the altar, we've got the wood. I see you have the fire and the knife. Like, where is the sacrifice? And I can't even imagine. Like, sometimes we read these stories and we just like read over it like it's no big deal. I can't imagine like what is going through Abraham's mind at this point, because he's like, son, God told me that you have to be the sacrifice. And I don't know. I have no idea what's going through either Abraham's mind or Isaac's mind. I don't know if Isaac is like, okay, Dad, I know you believe in God, and we've been moving our entire lives, like going to where God's showing us, and I get that, and so I know you trust them, and I trust them, and so let's do this, okay? I'm good with it. Or if he's like, Dad, you have lost your mind. Like, why would God say that? God said that your like descendants would come through me. Like, what are you doing? I can't imagine. But whatever happens, Abraham gets Isaac onto the altar, onto the wood, and he has his knife drawn, and he's getting ready to kill his son so he could burn him in this offering to God. And God says, hey, well, hold on, Abraham, do not take his life. And God provides a ram to be sacrificed. And so at the end of the story here, in verse 13, I believe, it says, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And I think about what has taken place there. Like, hey, Abraham was supposed to sacrifice his son, and he honored God, and he put God first, and he was going to do exactly what God wanted. But God provided this ram as an alternative to sacrificing his son. And once again, we see this foreshadowing of God providing a way for us not to die, so through a means that he only could provide. And so that's just one of the foreshadowings of like what Jesus did when he died on the cross. Another one can be found in the very next book, in the book of Exodus. Many of you are familiar with the story of Israel. Like after Abraham, there was Isaac, and Isaac had Jacob and Esau, and Jacob had 12 sons, Joseph being one of them, and their people just, kind of exploded while they were in Goshen. There was a famine, so they moved to Goshen, and Joseph, like that whole story. So they're there, and then Joseph dies, and the Pharaoh who knew Joseph died, and the new Pharaoh came, and he didn't know anything about Joseph, and he saw all these Israelite people, and they were like, hey, if they join our enemies, they could like do damage to us or overthrow us, and so let's make them slaves. And so for 400 years, Israel was enslaved to the Egyptians. And so at one point, and God appears to a man named Moses, and it's like, hey, go back to Egypt. I want to lead my people out. I want to free them. I've heard their groans. I've seen their suffering. I'm going to do something about it. Go to Egypt. And man, it's a great story. If you haven't read it, you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to read it. Beginning of Exodus kind of tells you about Moses and all that. But in Exodus 10, like God's sent Moses to Egypt, and he's confronting the Pharaoh and all of Pharaoh's officials. And Pharaoh was like, hey, no, I understand you want to go worship God. You want to go into the desert, and you want all your people to go. That ain't happening. And so because of Pharaoh's hard heart, and because God was also hardening his heart, God was revealing like his authority over all the gods of Egypt. And that's another teaching. I don't have time to really get into it. But to do that, God sent 10 plagues to show his authority over nature and creation and over all the supposed gods of Egypt to help free the people of Israel. All right? And so there were these plagues, the plague of blood, where the Nile was turned to blood, the plague of frog and gnats and flies and livestock and boils and hail and locust and darkness, and all of these plagues were taking place. And then there was this one final one. Like after everyone, like Pharaoh, like at the beginning, he was like, no, I'm not letting you go. I don't care. And then finally, he was like for most of them, he was saying, you can go. Oh, I'm going to change my mind. You can't go anymore. And so this last plague was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for both Pharaoh and for the people of Egypt. And so the 10th plague was the plague of the firstborn, where every firstborn male in Egypt was going to be destroyed. God told Moses, tell the whole community of Israel. Like in preparation for this last plague, tell the whole community of Israel. If you want to follow along in your Bible, it's not going to be on the screen, I don't think. But you can find it in Exodus chapter 12, verses 3 through 7. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor. Having taken into account the number of people there are, you are to determine the amount of the lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defects. They wanted perfect year-old male lambs, all right? And you are to take them from the sheep or goats, take them until the 14th day of the month, when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. They will be able to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the house where they eat the lambs. And God continued. In verses 12 and 13, he says, on that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. Because of the Passover lamb, the lamb that was sacrificed for the people, the destroying angel would not touch them. Death would not enter into their homes. The firstborn males would not be killed. And on that night, the Lord passed through Egypt, and on every house where that blood was not on the doors, every firstborn male, human and animal, was destroyed. And so when it comes to remembering the Passover, understanding the foreshadowing of like every year, generation after generation, the Israelites celebrated and remembered this miraculous event that took place that allowed them to go free. In a foreshadowing of the Messiah, the blood of the Passover lamb prevented the angel of wrath from being poured out on Israel. You know what? All the prophecies and all the foreshadowing would have been irrelevant if the Messiah didn't come and fulfill them. Like, it's one thing making bold predictions. Like, people do it all the time in sports, like, hey, this team's going to win, or that team's going to win, or this is going to happen. And, you know, sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. 350 prophecies story after story, experience after experience, illustrated what was going to take place in the life of the Messiah, and every single one of them were fulfilled. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, Paul connects the dots with a simple statement. He says, "For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." Like, you can't get any clearer. Like, hey, that story of the Passover, it was significant in its time, but the real significance is seen in the fact that Christ, the Messiah, the Savior, which we're going to talk about in the last message, the Savior has come. The Lamb has been slain, not for his glory, not for his benefit, but for ours. And then in 1 Peter 1, verses 18 through 20, Peter continues to point the truth out that for now, that is not with, for you know, that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from our ancestors. Like, it's not money that did it. Verse 19 says, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish, without defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but has revealed in these last times for your sake. We think about all of the prophecies, all of the foreshadowing, and we know that it was through those things that the Messiah was revealed. Both in Peter and Paul, they looked at the Passover, in which the Jews celebrated every year, and they pointed out the fact that they needed to reveal truth. It was revealed through, like I said, the prophecies, through the foreshadowings, but I also want to look at the life of the Messiah. When we look at the life of the Messiah, we see that day after day, prophecy after prophecy was being fulfilled. We look at his birth, we look at his lineage, like some of the things, the ways the prophecies were revealed were in things that he had no control over. Like Jesus had no control, well, being God he did, but being a baby, like where he was born and those things, like a normal person couldn't control that, like when they were born, how they were born, the circumstances, the location, like the fact that all these prophecies were being fulfilled is significant. We look at his birth, we look at his lineage, his childhood, his priorities, his ministry. We can see all the prophecies were coming true. The most abundant of those prophecies, the most significant prophecies were fulfilled in the last days of Jesus' life. During this time, we find Jesus in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover with his disciples. What we've been talking about in Exodus is once again still being celebrated, still being recognized in Jesus' life. Now, he's celebrating the Passover with mixed emotions. He begins to share his disciples how the next few days would unfold. Jesus predicts his betrayal. He predicts being disowned. He predicts being abandoned by his disciples. He predicts his death. His disciples couldn't believe what he was saying. They were in constant denial, like, hey, we would never do that. We would never say that. We're going to be with you. Even if we have to die with you, we'll be there with you. The disciples just didn't understand. And over the next several hours, his disciples watched helplessly as all the things that Jesus said was happening, they took place. How he was betrayed, how he was arrested, how he was abandoned, how he was denied, how he was mocked and tried and stripped and beaten and crucified, and how he died and was buried in a tomb. And as Jesus was laid to rest in that tomb, and as that stone was rolled in front of it, the hope that Jesus had instilled in his disciple probably drained away. Like, what happened? And although Peter, early on, when Jesus asked, who do you say that I am? Peter identified, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah. You're the one who was anointed and the one who was set apart to save us. failed to recognize the significance of the Christ, failed to recognize the significance of the Messiah, that Jesus had to be betrayed, that he had to be abandoned, that he had to be beaten and spit upon and crucified and mocked, because each and every one of those actions was predicted. And so as the stone was rolled in front of the tomb, I imagine hearts were broken. The disciples were discouraged. They were probably at a loss. But as we all know, that's not how the story of the Messiah ends. As the book of Psalm tells us, weeping may remain for a night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. 3 days later, the disciples witnessed one of the most amazing things. As they went back to the tomb, the stone was rolled away, the tomb was empty, and Jesus has risen. And so today, as we prepare for a time for communion, I just want to encourage you to just think about the significance of the Messiah in your life. Like each year, the Israelites would remember the significance of the Passover lamb that allowed them to escape without their sons and their animals dying needlessly. We think about what Jesus did on the cross and what the bread and the juice represent for us, so much more significant. Because not only was it for just one person in each household, Jesus' broken body and his shed blood was for all of us. In a broken and fallen world where we fall, and where we sin. So I'm going to ask you to sing with us as we prepare ourselves for communion this morning.